North America just witnessed a seismic jolt that no farmer, worker, or retiree saw coming. Canada slammed the door on American goods, cloaking the move in the language of safety, yet leaving behind a trail of stranded trucks, wasted harvests, and broken livelihoods. Within just 48 hours, trade worth billions evaporated, while Mexico quietly welcomed $12 billion in new investments, stepping into the very role the U.S. once held. If neighbors no longer trust America's food, what does that say about the safety of what ends up on our own plates? And how many industries can collapse before the dominoes reach our dinner tables? The numbers sting like open wounds. More than $300 million in lettuce sales gone, over $340 million in tomatoes wiped out, and nearly $900 million in beef exports slashed. These are not abstract figures. They are jobs, mortgages, and communities in freefall. The cracks are spreading, and the question lingers. How much more can America afford to lose before the system itself caves in? This is the Downturn Report, where the truth gets personal. Tonight we expose the 7 industries now unraveling after Canada's stunning trade strike. A general look. It was not just a ban. It was a guillotine drop on American soil, slicing straight through the backbone of farming towns that had already been hanging by a thread. When Canada's officials stood before cameras in early 2025 and announced their food safety embargo on U.S. produce, it sounded like a bureaucratic notice. But in reality, it was the equivalent of padlocking the barn door and tossing the key into the river. Within just 48 hours, border crossings transformed into graveyards for truckloads of fresh vegetables, their colors fading from crisp green to dull brown as drivers sat helpless, watching entire fortunes rot behind refrigerated doors. Imagine working a field for months only to see your crop denied entry and left to spoil in a parking lot. That's the nightmare thousands of American families woke up to overnight. What made this strike so brutal was not just the suddenness, but the betrayal. Canada had long relied on U.S. farms for lettuce, tomatoes, and countless other staples. In 1 year alone, they had imported more than $330 million in lettuce and nearly $340 million in tomatoes. But now those markets were wiped clean like numbers erased from a chalkboard. Why? Because Canada declared it had lost trust in America's ability to grow food safely. After years of repeated E. coli outbreaks and pesticide scandals, they decided the risk wasn't worth it. On paper, it looked like a noble concern for public health. In practice, it was a cold, calculated divorce from dependence on U.S. farms. Canada had been preparing this escape route in silence, investing in domestic greenhouses and signing new supply deals overseas, so when the hammer fell, it was no accident. It was a planned evacuation. The devastation at home was immediate. Small towns that lived and breathed agriculture saw their financial lifeblood cut off like a faucet suddenly shut tight. Layoffs rippled across rural America. Banks circled like vultures around debt-ridden farms, and local economies fell into free fall. The image of farmers forced to plow unsold crops back into the dirt became the symbol of this collapse. Food turning into waste while families went hungry. And just when America was staggering, Mexico appeared at the table like the unexpected guest who not only takes your chair, but eats your dinner too. Backed by $12 billion from eager global investors, Mexico erected sprawling high-tech greenhouses across Sinaloa, Sonora, and Baja California, built new highways and ports, and polished itself up for the global stage. While American produce sat spoiling in warehouses, Mexico signed gleaming new contracts with Europe and Asia, offering prices up to 25% cheaper than what the U.S. had been demanding. This was more than trade friction, it was a transfer of power. At the very moment American farmers were staring at unpaid bills and empty silos, Mexico was crowned the new, reliable supplier. The same countries that once knocked on America's door for lettuce and tomatoes now turned their backs, finding cheaper, steadier options elsewhere. And for working-class Americans who grew up believing that the nation's farmland was untouchable, the lesson could not be crueler. When the trust of the world slips away, it doesn't matter how many acres you own, your crops may as well be weeds. Number 1. Tomato. The tomato industry did not just stumble. It was shoved off a cliff. Canada's sudden embargo hit like a hammer blow, and within days, what had once been a steady river of red rolling across the border turned into a stagnant pool of waste. For decades, Canada had been a vital market for tomatoes grown in California and Florida, with truckloads rumbling north by the hundreds each month. Then came the ban, and overnight an estimated $340 million in annual tomato sales simply evaporated. Perishable crops have no patience, and this time, entire harvests rotted in warehouses and on trucks, their value vanishing as fast as fruit flies swarm a kitchen counter. Industry groups described it bluntly. Tomato growers were thrown into a tailspin, spiraling with no parachute. The official excuse sounded routine. Canada claimed U.S. tomatoes contained pesticide residues and inconsistent quality, but behind the curtain, the timing spoke louder than any press release. Just weeks before pulling the trigger, Canada had pumped $180 million into expanding greenhouse tomato production in British Columbia and Ontario. In plain English, they no longer needed American farmers. Once their own supply chain could stand, regulators had every reason to slam the door shut. That is why American growers, like a Fresno farmer quoted in disbelief, said, "The problem wasn't our crop quality. The problem was Canada already had an alternative. It was less about safety than about strategy." And the Americans were left holding the bag. The shockwave didn't stop at the farm gate. Across California's Central Valley and Florida's Tomato Belt, packing sheds dimmed their lights, with places like a Watsonville facility shuttering entirely, tossing hundreds of workers into unemployment. Trucking companies that once hauled tomato loads north suddenly had no routes to run. Fertilizer dealers, seed suppliers, and carton manufacturers all reported vanishing orders. Economists warned of a multiplier effect, where each dollar lost at the farm drained $2 from the surrounding community. The numbers confirm it. Agricultural loan delinquencies spiked more than 70% in tomato regions since the ban, and farm foreclosures are climbing like a runaway elevator. In some rural counties, unemployment hit above 30%, a nightmare figure not seen since the crash of 2008. For families who had grown tomatoes for generations, the land they once saw as a legacy is now being auctioned off under bank pressure. Meanwhile, Mexico played opportunist with surgical precision. With $12 billion in new investments, they flooded markets with cheaper greenhouse-grown tomatoes, seizing contracts once dominated by U.S. growers. European buyers, eager for year-round supply and lower prices, switched allegiance without hesitation. Canadian supermarkets quickly replaced U.S. shipments with domestic or Mexican tomatoes, and shoppers barely noticed except for a small bump in prices. For U.S. farmers, however, this wasn't just about a lost customer. It was about losing global credibility. An EU analyst summarized it with icy clarity. America's edge was reliability, and once that reputation cracked, buyers sprinted to alternatives. Now U.S. tomatoes are losing shelf space not just in Canada, but across the Atlantic as well. This is not just a downturn, it is an existential collapse. What started as a safety ban has spiraled into a freefall of exports, domestic oversupply, collapsing prices, and a tidal wave of bankruptcies. For older Americans watching the headlines, the fear feels personal. If even the tomato, a crop as American as backyard gardens and Sunday sauces, can be pushed aside this quickly, what other industries are standing on the edge of the same cliff? Number 2. Lettuce. If the tomato collapse felt like a punch to the gut, the downfall of lettuce and leafy greens landed like a knife to the throat. Canada's import crackdown on U.S. romaine, once a quirk of red tape, has now mutated into a full-scale blockade, and America's so-called salad bowl is bleeding out. Back in 2018, Canada had snapped up more than $33 million worth of American lettuce, a cornerstone of trade that kept California's Salinas Valley and Arizona's Yuma fields alive. But by the fall of 2025, that pipeline was cut, seized, and welded shut. What used to be a reliable market turned into a wall of rejection slips and border checkpoints demanding lab tests most farmers couldn't even afford to run. Truckloads of romaine were turned back, left to wilt and blacken like a forgotten head of lettuce at the back of the fridge. Canadian officials wrapped their move in the cloak of public safety, citing outbreak after outbreak of E. coli 0157 H7 traced to California romaine between 2016 and 2019. They declared they had lost trust in American greens, not just a warning, but a verdict of guilt, and the hammer fell with almost no notice, barely a week for importers and growers to comply with brand new testing requirements. Imagine the chaos. Shipments already en route to Canada were suddenly worthless without 60 test samples per truckload, proving absolute zero traces of contamination. Growers who had already harvested and packed their lettuce found the market gone in the time it took a truck to drive from Salinas to the border. What was once a thriving export system became a bonfire of wasted crops. The economic crater is undeniable. Wholesale prices in the U.S. collapsed under the weight of surplus. Greens that would have fetched solid returns abroad are now flooding domestic shelves, dragging prices into the dirt. Farmers are bleeding money twice over, first from lost sales and second from costly new safety programs. They are scrambling to implement just to restore a shred of credibility. Packing plants have cut shifts, leaving workers with fewer hours and thinner paychecks. Some growers are abandoning acreage, letting fields go unharvested rather than spending more to ship lettuce no one will buy. Reports from Salinas and Yuma count millions in evaporated revenue, with the ripple effect tearing through fertilizer suppliers, trucking outfits, and small-town banks that suddenly see waves of farm loan delinquencies piling up. And while American farms buckle, Canada hasn't gone hungry. Supermarkets quickly filled their shelves with domestic greenhouse greens or foreign imports, while Mexican growers sniffed out new deals. Canadian shoppers hardly blinked. The lettuce in their carts looked the same, maybe cost a touch more, but no one staged protests at the checkout line. For U.S. farmers, the insult runs deeper than lost sales. It's the loss of trust. Once a retailer rebuilds its supply lines with greener, cheaper, or closer options, why would they return? Industry groups warn that this is not a temporary ban, it's a restructuring of the marketplace, and America's lettuce fields are the ones being written out of the script. Now farmers stand on a cliff's edge. Lettuce is a perishable crop with razor-thin margins, and the Canadian restrictions have shredded the fragile timing it depends on. Every day the ban drags on, more loads are plowed under unsold, more jobs vanish, more farms tip closer to foreclosure. Some producers whisper bitterly that Canada's crackdown was less about microbes and more about muscling room for its own indoor farming boom. Whatever the motive, the result is the same: a disaster dressed up as a health precaution. As one wary grower said, staring out at fields of unsellable romaine, "If we can't sell, we can't plant." And that warning hangs in the air like a funeral bell for an industry already gasping for breath. Number 3. Apple. If tomatoes were shoved off a cliff and lettuce had its throat cut, then America's apple growers are now watching the orchard they built for generations rot on the branch. Canada, once the #1 customer for Washington apples, is quietly turning its back. In 2024 alone, Canadian buyers purchased $132 million worth of Washington apples. Red Delicious, Gala, Granny Smith, shipped straight into Ontario and British Columbia stores. Those exports once filled Canadian pantries every winter, keeping U.S. growers profitable through the cold months. Now the demand is drying up fast, and in the valleys of Yakima and Wenatchee, storage warehouses are swelling with unsold fruit. The alarm bells aren't ringing anymore, they're screaming. What triggered this collapse? Canada hasn't slapped down a flashy public ban, but the reality feels the same. Inspections were tightened, shipments were turned back at the border for alleged pests like codling moth or apple maggot, and officials hinted they were just protecting their own orchards. The truth stings. Behind the talk of invasive species, the move looks like a protectionist wall, carefully built to keep U.S. apples out. Layer onto that the sour mood of trade tensions. Canadian consumers being nudged to buy domestic, retailers preferring fruit from Chile or New Zealand, and even localized boycotts of American products. The result? Truckloads of Washington apples that should be lining shelves in Toronto are instead piling up in cold storage, sucking money out of farming families who depend on Canadian orders just to break even. The timing couldn't be worse. Apples aren't like lettuce that you can plow under. These are trees planted for 20 years of harvest. Once they produce, you can't flip a switch and change crops. The apples keep coming whether the market is ready or not, and every box left unsold is a box of debt. Prices inside the US have cratered because of oversupply, leaving smaller farms especially exposed. Families who for decades have relied on Canadian sales now face foreclosure notices on their orchards. The numbers show just how brutal this is. Apples made up 16% of Washington's farm economy in 2022, worth more than $2 billion. Losing the #1 export market is not just a paper loss. It is a wrecking ball tearing through the state's rural economy. Packing house shifts have been cut, truckers have lost routes, and entire communities are bracing for tax shortfalls. Meanwhile, Canadian orchards, much smaller in scale but now celebrated like national treasures, are cashing in. In British Columbia, stores proudly hang signs saying "Grown in Canada," appealing to patriotic shoppers eager to prove self-reliance. The contrast couldn't be sharper. While American apples sit in storage, Canadian produce is paraded across supermarket aisles like a flag planted in victory. Washington growers are scrambling to redirect exports to India or Southeast Asia, and while some contracts are being signed, $19.5 million in sales to India last year, the prices are lower and the logistics brutal. A market next door can't be replaced by one halfway across the globe. One grower summed up the despair. We planted trees expecting them to last 2 decades, and now we might not last 2 more seasons. This is the cruelty of trade wars laid bare. The apple, that symbol of American abundance, has been pushed aside in Canada's grocery aisles, replaced by neighbors and rivals who smelled weakness. For older Americans watching this unfold, the message is chilling. If a fruit that filled our lunchboxes and lunch pails for generations can be discarded overnight, then no corner of American farming is safe from the next political storm. Number 4. Beef. If lettuce was choked and apples left to rot, then America's beef industry has been gutted like a steer on the slaughter line. Canada, one of the top 5 buyers of U.S. beef, suddenly turned from partner to punisher. In 2023 alone, Canada bought over 103,500 metric tons of U.S. beef, worth about $875 million. Premium ribeyes for Canadian supermarkets, ground beef for their fast food chains. All of it once flowed north like clockwork, but when trade tensions boiled over, Canada slapped tariffs, tightened rules, and provinces like Ontario went further, outright rejecting U.S. beef shipments in spring of 2025. Overnight, the border went cold, and the U.S. beef pipeline was butchered. For American ranchers and packers, this is a nightmare written in blood-red ink. Feedlots in the Texas Panhandle and across the Midwest were suddenly stuck with cattle meant for export, animals eating feed with no buyers in sight. Packing plants from Kansas to Nebraska slowed slaughter lines because Canadian orders had vanished. Live cattle prices, which keep ranchers alive, plunged even as feed costs stayed high. Economists at Texas A&M calculated millions in losses every single week the Canadian market stays shut. Smaller family ranches, already balancing on thin margins, now face the unthinkable: selling off herds, closing gates, and watching generations of work collapse in months. The irony? While U.S. ranchers drown in oversupply, Canadian consumers are paying more. Analysts report beef prices in some provinces rising 5 to 8% since the cutoff, but Canadian officials are willing to stomach higher prices, framing it as a patriotic sacrifice to wean off U.S. dependence. Canadian packers are sourcing from domestic herds, or even reaching out to Australia and South America to fill gaps. Every contract signed with someone else means American ranchers lose another customer they may never win back. And just like in produce, Mexico has swooped in like a buzzard circling the carcass. U.S. ranchers desperate to offload cattle are shipping south, where the animals are processed or re-exported, adding cost, cutting profit. Meanwhile, Mexico itself is striking gold. News broke of new Mexican beef deals with Asian countries, contracts that could be worth billions. If Canada shifts to buying more from Mexico, the U.S. could lose not just its northern neighbor, but wider global market share. Once again, Mexico plays the opportunist, turning America's misfortune into its own feast. The fallout spreads far beyond ranch fences. Workers in urban packing plants, jobs in Nebraska, Kansas, and Texas that anchor local economies, now face shortened hours or outright layoffs. Futures markets are jittery, reflecting the panic of lost exports. Bankers are watching cattlemen miss payments. And in rural towns, the mood is grim. This isn't just another dip in commodity prices. This is a perfect storm where tariffs, bans, oversupply, and foreign competitors all slash into the same wound. For older Americans watching, the betrayal cuts deep. The beef industry isn't just about steak dinners. It's about the backbone of the heartland, the cattle herds stretching across pastures that symbolize strength and independence. If even beef can be sidelined, replaced by imports or politics, what faith is left that America's food system will protect its own people? The message is chilling. The rancher's loss today could be the worker's empty fridge tomorrow. Number 5. Pork. If beef has been gutted, pork has been carved to the bone. The U.S. pork industry, an engine of the Midwest and the pride of states like Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois, has been hammered straight into crisis by the Canadian trade freeze. In 2023, Canada ranked as the fourth largest buyer of U.S. pork, taking in nearly 220,000 metric tons worth, about $875 million. From thick cuts for roasts, to processed ham, to the bacon that Canadians fried for breakfast every morning, U.S. pork crossed the border in a steady stream. That stream has now run dry. Canadian tariffs, border frictions, and even provincial boycotts have sliced the market apart. Overnight, orders that once kept rural barns humming disappeared, leaving hog farmers staring at unsold herds and empty contracts. The timing could not be worse. Pork farmers were already gasping under the weight of high feed costs and reduced buying from China, the world's hungriest pork consumer. Losing Canada added insult to injury, dumping tens of thousands of tons of surplus meat back into the domestic market. Wholesale pork prices collapsed, and the familiar Midwest complaint, "We can't sell it for what it costs to raise it," became a reality on a massive scale. By mid-2025, U.S. pork exports overall had slipped behind the previous year's pace, and the absence of Canada loomed as the gaping hole. Farmers who bet their livelihoods on steady exports now find themselves drowning in debt, some forced to cull herds or halt breeding cycles to staunch the bleeding. Yet cutting supply is slow. In the meantime, barns echo with the sound of hogs that no one can afford to buy. The effect ripples outward. Processing plants across the Midwest, once running full tilt, are scaling back shifts, slowing slaughter lines, and in some cases idling entire departments. For small rural towns where the meatpacking plant is the major employer, the slowdown means layoffs, unpaid bills, and grocery stores with fewer customers walking in the door. Agricultural economists call it the textbook case of oversupply crushing prices, and the phrase is no comfort to families now facing bankruptcy. Hog prices have plunged to multi-year lows, and with bank loans still due, the math no longer works. One farmer in Iowa put it plainly, "We don't just lose money on every hog, we lose the farm with them." And as America bleeds, Canada and Mexico pocket the spoils. Canada, already a strong pork producer in Quebec and Manitoba, has stepped into the gap, its own exports booming past $3 billion in 2023. With U.S. pork slowed by tariffs, Canadian meat now enjoys greater space both at home and abroad. Mexico, too, is reaping gains. Not only do Mexican buyers import cheaper U.S. pork amid the glut, their own producers are securing export deals abroad alongside Canadian packers, targeting Asia with the pitch of reliability that the U.S. can no longer offer. What was once a seamless North American meat market under USMCA has fractured, and every fracture widens the space for competitors to muscle in. For U.S. pork producers, the nightmare feels existential. This was supposed to be an integrated system. Canada sending millions of piglets south for finishing, America sending pork north in return. That efficient loop has now been broken, and no quick fix exists. The fear is not just of temporary losses, but of permanent damage. Breeding stock lost, family farms sold off, and small-town processing plants shuttered for good. Farmers and industry leaders are pleading with Washington to resolve the dispute, but the clock is ticking. Each week of stalled trade brings more bankruptcies, more layoffs, and more ground lost in global markets. For older Americans, the symbolism hits hard. Pork isn't just food, it's the Sunday ham, the backyard bacon, the smell of a kitchen that once promised security. Watching barns fall silent and plants shut down, while neighbors seize the very markets we built, is a reminder that no meal is guaranteed. The pork collapse tells a brutal truth. In a world of shifting politics and ruthless trade wars, even the most familiar staple can vanish from our tables if the system built to protect it collapses. Number 6. Corn. The collapse of corn is less like an explosion and more like a slow suffocation. Canada may not sound like the obvious villain here. It grows plenty of its own corn, but the numbers don't lie. In 2024, Canada bought over 2.17 million tons of U.S. corn, worth about $620 million, making it the 5th largest market for American farmers. That steady demand helped keep Midwest growers afloat, especially in states like Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio. Much of the grain went north to feed Canadian cattle and hogs or into ethanol plants. Now in the aftermath of tariffs and trade spats, those orders have dried up. By early 2025, Canadian imports of U.S. corn were virtually non-existent, according to official data. A phrase that chills farmers more than a Midwest blizzard. The fallout is brutal. Grain elevators in border states are turning away shipments. Storage bins are overflowing, and prices on U.S. commodity markets have sagged under the weight of surplus. Farmers who counted on Canada to absorb part of their harvest suddenly face piles of corn with nowhere to go. For bulk commodities like corn, margins are razor thin. Even small price drops can flip a farm from profit to loss. After paying for seed, fertilizer, and fuel, many farmers are left with debts that their crops can't cover. Some have begun talking of switching crops or idling land altogether, a desperate sign in the heart of the Corn Belt. The strategic worry is darker still. Trade disputes force buyers to find new supply chains, and once they're built, they tend to stick. Canada has already tapped Ukraine and Brazil for corn, and even looked at European feed wheat as an alternative. If that shift becomes permanent, U.S. farmers may never regain the lost market. Worse, Mexico, America's #1 corn customer, with $5.7 billion in imports last year, is making noise about boosting its own production and even restricting GMO corn from the U.S. If both neighbors cut demand, the American Corn Belt could face its sharpest downturn in decades. The silos may be full, but the farmers' pockets are empty, and that's a dangerous equation for rural America. When food security crumbles under politics and greed, will America awaken before our tables stand empty forever? Subscribe now.
Thank you for watching today's video all the way through. If you found the content helpful, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest daily videos. Now, feel free to check out other feature videos currently showing on your screen. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.